Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Layout Building. In this episode, I'm going to continue working on our N-scale Siren Creek project layout. I'll be installing a switch machine on the turnout that I built in the last episode. Our N-scale Siren Creek layout is designed to be small enough that Nichole and I can take it with us when we travel in our RV. It's also a way for me to do some model railroading while I'm waiting for the train room for my future HO scale layout to be completed. In the last episode, I built the first of several dual gauge turnouts on the layout. I tested the turnout and it works, but I have to manually hold the points when a train goes through. In this episode, I'm going to complete the turnout by installing a switch machine and connecting it to one of the stationary decoders under the layout. When I'm done, the turnout should be fully functional. Since I'll have to do this same operation again for every other turnout on the layout, I'm making this part of the build its own standalone episode. I have a bunch of these Switchmaster slow motion switch machines left over from a previous layout, so that's what I'm going to use. They work well with the Digitrax DS64 stationary decoders that I installed under the layout in episode 5. I'll also be using some small brass tubing and some 020 steel wire from K&S. If you watched the last episode where I built the turnout, you may recall that it's DCC friendly. The rails are always energized and not dependent on mechanical contact. Frog juicers take care of energizing the frogs and switching the polarity as needed. This setup separates the track power wiring from the physical motion of the switch points. The only job the switch machine has to do is to move the switch points and hold them in place. That means that I don't need to worry about auxiliary contacts, which is good since the switch machines I'm using don't have them. With this setup, the only wiring a switch machine needs is a pair of wires to power its own motor. This would also be a good setup if I wanted to use ground throws or some other mechanical method of moving the switch points. The mechanical linkage would do exactly the same job as the switch machine, and the track power wiring would be exactly the same. The switch machine needs a linkage to connect to the turnout. I'm going to construct one with steel wire and brass tubing. The 020 wire that I'm using is a little smaller than the wire that originally came with the switch machines. I think the smaller size looks and works better for N-scale. Steel wire works well for turnout linkages because it's both strong and springy. I'll start by drilling a hole through the roadbed near the turnout throw bar. Now I can insert a piece of tubing from the top. The exact length doesn't matter, but it should stick down slightly below the plywood under the layout. I'll cut the tubing with a razor saw. Now I can install the tubing. Next, I'll bend the steel wire into a shape like this. The distance between the bends should match the distance between the hole in the turnout throw bar and the tubing. I flipped the layout over. I'm going to push the excess tubing into the plywood so that it won't get bent when I bend the steel wire. I'll pull up on the wire. After checking the orientation of the upper bend, I can bend the wire under the table. The under the table bend can go in any direction that's convenient. With the layout right side up again, I've pushed the brass tubing back down and connected the linkage to the turnout. I can now operate the turnout by reaching under the layout. This is the switch machine that I'm going to use. This one is left over from a prior layout. Before I install it, I want to redo the wiring. It's hard to see, but there are markings on the case for positive and negative. I'm going to use the blue wire on the positive and orange for the negative. I haven't used these colors yet for any of the other layout wiring. As I mentioned in episode 5, having some kind of color coding scheme for wiring is a good idea. On this layout, I'll only use dark blue and orange for switch machines. I've temporarily removed the resistor from the positive lead. The resistor came with the switch machine. I'll slip some heat shrink tubing over the positive wire. Now I can resolder the resistor and shrink the tubing over the joint. I'll connect the blue wire next. And finally, I'll connect the orange wire to the negative lead. I decided to splice the wire rather than just replace the short black wire to avoid heating up the switch machine. I've left the wires attached to the spools for now since I don't know exactly how long they'll need to be. Next, I want to reposition the brass actuator arm and secure it to the output shaft. The shaft is steel, so it doesn't take solder well. Building up some solder on the brass helps to lock the arm in place. It seems pretty solid now and the arm is repositioned the way I want it. At one point I had a drill template for the mounting holes, but I'm not sure where it went. It's just as easy to measure. The holes are 2 1/8 inches apart. The holes should be oriented perpendicular to the steel throw rod. The steel rod goes through the loop in the actuator arm. Because of the tight clearances, I had to drill a hole through the wood on the bottom to get a screwdriver through. With the switch machine mounted, I can figure out how long to make the wires. I've cut the wires and attached them to the screw terminals on one of the DS64s. I'm using outputs 1R and 1G. I've used a lot of cable ties to keep the wiring as neat as I can. Now I need to set up the DS64 to use slow motion switch machines and program the turnout address. Following the instructions, I've temporarily disconnected the switch machine. I'll press and hold the OPS button until the red and green LEDs blink. Then on my throttle, I'll select switch address 1 and press close. The DS64 will now work with slow motion switch machines. I'll press OPS again to get out of programming mode. To set the switch machine addresses, I'll press and hold the ID button until the green LED starts blinking. You have to program all 4 addresses at once, even if they're not yet being used. I'm using 1 through 4 on this one for now. I'll select address 1, then hit throw or closed. I'll repeat the same procedure for the remaining addresses. Let's test it out. I've set the address to 1. If I hit switch 1 throw, the points line for the diverging route. When I hit close, they line for the main. One thing I like about the DS64 is that it can use either DCC commands or push buttons to throw a switch. Eventually, when I add control panels, I can add some buttons. Meanwhile, though, I have a functional turnout that I can control with the throttle. This is a good place to stop for now. Now that the switch machine is installed, I consider the turnout fully operational. Next time I'll build the last 2 mainline turnouts.